So it's been over 2 months since the Lenovo Legion Go launched, and today we're going to be comparing it to the Asus ROG Ally in 20 games. And I wanted to make this list as interesting as possible, so I tested out games from different genres like first-person shooters like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, Titanfall 2, and more. We'll be testing racing games like Forza Horizon 5 and Dirt 5, and we'll even be covering third-person games like The Witcher 3, Batman, GTA 5, and more. And of course, we can't forget about indie games, so we'll be covering some of those as well. And during all of this benchmarking, I was using the latest AMD drivers for both the Ally and Legion Go as of the recording of this video, which is 23.12.1. And I've set the GPU VRAM limit to 6GB of VRAM, so without further ado, let's get straight into it. First game we have up is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, and in this scene we're just in a firefight in the first mission of the game. At 720p with F-Star 2.1 enabled at 100% render resolution using the basic preset, which is mostly all low settings, the Legion Go gives us a higher FPS average of about 108 frames per second, while the Ally trails behind with an average closer to the lower hundreds, sitting at around 102 frames. Switching over to 900p, of course we lose some performance, but we do gain some visual clarity, and once again the Legion Go comes out on top with an FPS average in the mid-90s, around 95 to 96 FPS. And the Ally sits in the high 80s, fluctuating from 87 to 88 FPS, so not a huge difference, but it is just outside the margin of error. At 1080p, we drop to the low 80s for the Legion Go, giving us an average of about 82 FPS, and the Ally once again trails behind with an FPS average in the mid to high 70s, sitting at about 76 FPS. It seems like this game really benefits from the faster RAM in the Legion Go, especially at the lower resolutions, but honestly, this game is very playable on both these systems. We're getting incredible performance even at 1080p. Next up we have Grand Theft Auto 5 at 720p using normal settings, and we're just using the jet scene in the in-game benchmark, and for the Legion Go we get an FPS average around 130 to 133 frames, and for the Ally we get an average of 122 to 124 frames per second. So it seems like once again the Legion Go's RAM is helping it out, giving it a slight edge of about 8 to 9 FPS. Switching over to 900p, the Legion Go drops to the mid to high 120s, sitting at around 125 to 127 FPS, and the Ally fluctuates from 114 to 115 FPS, so once again a pretty decent lead for Legion Go, almost about 10 frames extra. So while doing all of this benchmarking, I've really noticed that some games really benefit from the faster RAM in the Legion Go, and GTA 5 seems to be one of them. At 1080p, the Legion Go drops to about 117 to 118 frames per second, so you could say it's about a loss of about 10 frames from 900p, but still a very playable frame rate. The Ally, on the other hand, loses about 8 to 9 frames, averaging about 106 to 107 frames, so Legion Go takes this one as well with almost a 10 frame lead, so that is well outside the margin of error. But overall, this game is well optimized and plays great on both these devices. Up next is Titanfall 2, one of my favorite FPS shooters of all time. It has a great story, and we're running it at 720p with the high preset, and in this scene we're getting those nice high frame rates for the Legion Go. We get an average of about 139 to 140 FPS. And the Ally starts off in the high 130s but drops to the lower 130s as we progress in the scene, and we're getting insane frame rates on both these systems right now. Okay, at 900p, something interesting happens. The Ally actually takes the lead by a few frames that I would consider within the margin of error, but yeah, both these devices are hovering around 102 to 105 FPS, so very close and no major difference at 900p. And at 1080p, we drop to the mid 80s, sitting at 84 to 85 FPS on the Legion Go, and for the Ally, we're sitting at the low 80s, and it does drop to 79 FPS, so pretty close, just a few more frames for the Legion Go. Assassin's Creed Odyssey is up next, and we're running the in-game benchmark, and at 720p with the medium preset at the end of the benchmark, we get an FPS average of 62 for the Legion Go and 58 for the Ally, so just a 4 frame difference. At 900p running the same medium preset, the Legion Go drops to an average of 55 FPS, so a loss of about 7 frames, and the Ally drops to an average of 52 FPS, so we have a loss of about 6 frames from 720p, so not a big difference, and it's within the margin of error. Moving up to 1080p, the image quality is looking pretty crisp, and towards the end of the benchmark, the Legion Go scores an average of 47 FPS, while the Ally trails behind with an average of 44 frames per second. So just a 3 frame difference, not much to really see here. Next up, we have our first indie game called Astroneer, and the art style and graphics in this game are absolutely gorgeous. For this benchmark, I just ran around my ship, and the settings we have here is 720p with a mix of ultra and high settings, and both systems look pretty much identical when it comes to their average FPS, as they both hover around that 110 to 111 FPS. But there is a pretty big difference, and they're 1% low, as the Go is sitting at 90 FPS and the Ally is at 72 FPS. But nonetheless, very nice performance for both systems at 720p. At 900p, once again, both systems are pretty much identical, as they both get an FPS average in the low 90s, and their 1% lows are pretty identical as well. So Really no difference here at 900p. Upping the resolution to 1080p, we dropped to the 70s for both systems. However, the Legion Go does come up on top with a 77 FPS average, and the Ally sits around 73 frames per second. So the FPS average is within the margin of error, but the Legion Go does have a better 1% low than the Ally. Next game is Batman Arkham Knight, and we're using the in-game benchmark for this test. At 720p with low settings, at the end of the test, the Legion Go takes the lead with an FPS average of 97, and the Ally trails behind with an average FPS of 88. Moving on to 900p, we gain some visual clarity, but the performance gap does get closer between these two systems. The Go is sitting at 80 FPS, while the Ally scores a 74 FPS average. And at 1080p, the game is looking real nice, but of course we do take a good hit to our performance as the Legion Go drops to an average of 65 frames. And the Ally just misses the 60 FPS mark with an average of 59 frames, but these are still really good performance numbers for 1080p, and it's still very playable. Forza Horizon 5 is our next game, and this game is well optimized, and it's one of my favorite racing games. Once again, we're running the in-game benchmark for this test, and at 720p with the low preset with no upscaling, so this is native rendering. And at the end of the benchmark, the Legion Go gets an FPS average of 100 FPS, and the Ally comes in at 95 frames, so just a 5 frame difference. At 900p, the game looks a bit nicer, and at the end of the benchmark, the Go gets an 89 FPS average, so about a loss of 11 frames from 720p, but still very playable. And as for the Ally, we get an 85 FPS average, so we get a loss of about 10 frames from 720p, so just a 4 frame difference at 900p between these two, so that's within the margin of error. And at 1080p, the game is looking really good, and we're getting very playable frame rates on both systems. Towards the end of the benchmark, we end up with a 79 average for the Go and 75 for the Ally, so no major difference here and very playable even with native 1080p rendering. Next up, we have another indie title named Death's Door. I haven't played much of it, but based on what I've played so far and what I've heard about the game, it's pretty dang cool. Now, this game didn't give me any graphics options other than changing the resolution, so what we have here is 720p at whatever default settings they have the game set to. And while fighting this boss, both the Legion Go and Ally handle this game like champs, but the Go does give us a better 1% low though. At 900p, we drop to an FPS average of 108 for the Legion Go, and the Ally maintains an average that fluctuates from 103 to 105 FPS. And our 1% lows are looking pretty identical here as well, so no major difference here, guys. At 1080p, the Go drops to about 87 to 86 FPS in the average, but maintains a similar 1% low seen at 900p. And the Ally drops to the low 80s, hovering between 80 to 81 frames in the average, and it does take a decent hit to its 1% low compared to 900p, but nonetheless, this game is very playable on both systems. Now back to the AAA games we go. This is Far Cry 6 running at 720p with the medium preset with FSR 1.0 enabled and set to balance using the in-game benchmark tool. The Legion Go ends this test with an average FPS of 82, while the Ally finishes off with a 79 average, so pretty dang close. It's within the margin of error. And at 900p, we drop to an average FPS of 76 for the Go, and the Ally trails behind by 2 frames with an average of 74, so not that big of a loss from 720p, so that's good to see. Okay, moving on to 1080p, the image quality is looking beautiful, and towards the end of the benchmark, we finish off with a 70 FPS average for the Legion Go. And the Ally gets an average of 66, so pretty similar performance for both systems, and no major difference here once again here at 1080p. Okay, now we're talking. We've got the Division 2 here. The gameplay in this game is super addicting, but we're running this at 720p with the low preset. And in this firefight on the Legion Go, we're averaging around 86 FPS with a decent 1% low of 60 frames, while the Ally performs really well as well, giving us an average of 83 frames per second, but a lower 1% low than the Go at 51 FPS. Going over to 900p, we're still maintaining great performance from both systems. The Legion Go is averaging around 82 frames here, and the Ally is hitting the high 70s, averaging between 78 to 79 frames per second. At 1080p, once again, we're seeing very playable frame rates for both handhelds. The Go is averaging 77 frames per second, and the Ally is right behind it with an average of 75 frames. Now, although this game runs pretty well on both these handhelds, I did want to mention that this game is VRAM hungry, and at 1080p, as you can see, we're using about 5.5 gigabytes of VRAM, so it is approaching our 6 gigabyte VRAM limit. So you'll want to crank up your VRAM limit to above 4 gigabytes if you plan on playing at 1080p in the Division 2. Up next is Rainbow Six Siege, and this is another well-optimized title. We're running this at 720p here with the high preset, running the in-game benchmark, and we're reaching that 140 FPS mark, which is awesome, especially in a competitive game like this where it really matters. The Legion Go finishes off this test with an average of 142 frames, and the Ally takes the lead by 1 frame with an average average of 143 frames, so literally no difference between these two here. Okay, at 900p we get a better looking image of course, and we actually don't take that big of a hit to our performance as the Legion Go finishes off with an average of 138 frames. And the Ally averages an FPS of 134 frames, so still very playable at 900p, good performance all around here. At 1080p the game is looking really good and we still maintain a very playable frame rate on both handhelds. The Legion Go finishes off with an average of 123 frames, and the Ally comes in second with an average FPS of 118 frames, so just a 5 frame difference between the two at 1080p. This game is beyond playable on both handhelds. Switching it up completely, we've got Hi-Fi Rush up next, and we're running this game with the medium preset at 720p, and I just ran around this rooftop with some enemies around because this game has a lot of cutscenes at the beginning that kept on interrupting my testing, but I really love the gameplay of this game. It's a fresh style of gameplay for me. But here the Legion Go is getting a nice frame rate average of 107 to 108 frames and a pretty good 1% low of 82. The Ally on the other hand is doing pretty well also, averaging around 100 to 101 frames, but the 1% low is much lower than the Go, sitting at 59 FPS. At 900p, the Legion Go's average drops to the mid 90s and it fluctuates between 95 to 96 frames per second, while the Ally drops to the low 90s, switching between 92 to 93 FPS, and the 1% low is looking pretty similar for both devices. Moving on to 1080p, we do lose a good chunk of performance, but it's still really playable. The Legion Go averages 82 frames here, and the Ally is sitting in the high 70s with an average of about 77 frames per second, and I just want to say that this game's art style is absolutely epic. Up next is Dirt 5, another racing game here, but with a rally twist to it, and right away you can see this game is VRAM hungry, even at 720p, as we're pushing above the default 4GB VRAM limit that both these handhelds are set to. And we're using the in-game benchmark tool for this test using the medium preset, and our render resolution is set to 75%, and at the end of the test we get a 64 FPS average on the Go, and the Ally gets an average of 61 frames, and our 1% low is pretty similar, so I would say not a major difference here. Okay, here at 900p we actually don't lose that much performance at all on the Go. We only lose like 1 frame, so we went from a 64 average to a 63 average, so that is pretty interesting. The Ally on the other hand drops from a 61 average to a 57 average, so it did lose more performance than the Go, so this is just right outside the margin of error. Okay, on to 1080p, the game looks really good and our performance dips to a 61 average FPS for the Legion Go and 54 for the Ally, so about a 7 frame difference here. Alright, up next is Hogwarts Legacy, and as you can see right away, this game is not well optimized. This is running on the Legion Go with the low preset with FSR2 set to performance, and we're getting a really spiky frame time graph and a really bad 1% low. And what I've noticed is that this game runs really bad upon initial startup, so once the game loads in all of its textures and all that stuff, it runs a little bit better. So this is how the game runs in this part of the game after allowing it to essentially warm up. The frame time graph is looking a lot better, and the Legion Go is averaging 77 frames here, but it does have a poor 1% low of 37 for this frame rate. The Ally is averaging a frame rate of 72 to 73 frames per second, and its 1% low isn't much different from the Legion Go. Here at 900p, we drop to the high 60s for the Legion Go, averaging a frame rate of about 67 to 68 frames, and our 1% low is looking a bit better here at this resolution. The Ally on the other hand is right behind it with an FPS average of about 65 to 66 frames, so no big difference here in the averages, and the 1% low has gotten a little bit better here as well. Moving on to 1080p, and wow, this game looks really nice here. The Legion Go drops to the low 60s, averaging a frame rate from about 60 to 62 frames here. The Ally just misses the 60 FPS mark here, averaging a frame rate of about 57 to 58 frames per second, and the 1% lows are looking pretty identical, so not really a big difference here once again. But yeah, this game, although it may look like it runs good here, my experience playing it is much different, and it's much similar to what I showed you earlier where the frame time graph is all over the place, because you're constantly going into different places and having to wait for the game to load up, and it causes these really bad FPS spikes that really just pull me from the experience. So I would just keep that in mind if you do plan on playing this game on the Legion Go or Ally. Battlefield 3 is our next title, and guys, I was pretty shocked at the performance difference this game had between the Legion Go and Ally. At first I thought there was something like maybe hindering the Ally, but no, I went back and checked multiple times and the numbers I got before were the same that I got when I went back to redo this benchmark. But in this scene here, we have the game running at 720p with the medium preset, and the Legion Go is really dominating here, giving us an average FPS around 114 to 117 FPS, and the Ally is hovering around 92 to 94 frames, so a pretty big difference here. And at 900p, same story, the Legion Go is still dominating here, leading with an average frame rate of 105 to 108 frames, but it mostly stays at 105 FPS. Now the Ally did drop to the mid to high 80s, mostly staying around an average of 86 to 87 frames per second, which is not bad, but it is a lot less frames than what the Legion Go is producing. And at 1080p, the Legion Go finally drops below 100 plus frames, frames and is now averaging around like 96 to 99 frames per second, while the Ally dips to the high 70s, mostly staying at an average of 79 frames per second. So not bad performance for either system, but the clear winner is the Legion Go. Up next is Sifu, one of the coolest fighting games I've played, and it has a unique art style that makes the game feel different. I just used this fighting scene here for this benchmark at 720p using high settings, and the Legion Go has a pretty significant lead over the Ally. It's averaging in the mid to high 120s, and it goes up to about an average of 129 frames, while the Ally is still performing great here as well. It does trail behind with an average frame rate that fluctuates between 115 to 119 frames. So I would say the Go is the clear winner here at this resolution. Moving on to 900p, it seems like the Ally actually pulls ahead, getting a frame rate average of 100 to 105 frames. And at 1080p, we drop to the mid to high 80s, but still reaching the low 90s for the Legion Go. And the Ally averages 87 frames per second here, and the 1% lows are pretty identical as well, so no major difference here. Here we have The Witcher 3 running at 720p with the low preset, and I just rode Roach through this path for this benchmark, and the Legion Go's average frame rate is somewhere between 72 to 74 frames, while the Ally averages around 70 to 72 frames. So no huge difference here, but the Legion Go's 1% low is a bit better than the Ally's at 59 FPS. At 900p, we drop into the 50s for both the devices. The Legion Go stays at around 58 to 59 frames for the average, and the Ally gets an average FPS in the low to mid 50s of about 53 to 54 frames. Upping the resolution to 1080p, we drop into the 40s for both systems. The Legion Go gets an average FPS of 45 frames, and the Ally is closer to the low 40s, sitting at about 41 to 42 frames. So not really a huge difference between the two at the various resolutions. Okay, next is a really cool horror third-person game, Dead Space 3. Now this game runs phenomenal on both the Legion Go and Ally. I just used the opening scene of the game using the medium preset, and at 720p, as you can see, we're hitting 140 plus frames for both systems, and our 1% low is pretty much identical, so there's literally no difference at all here. Moving on to 900p, same story here, absolutely great performance on both systems as we're still averaging 140 plus frames, and the 1% low is still identical. At 1080p, we do lose like a tiny bit of performance, but the Legion Go is still averaging 140 plus frames. Same with the Ally for the most part, but it does dip to like 139 frames, but you would not be able to tell the difference between the two at all without the frame rate counter. So yeah, overall, Dead Space 3 is a really well optimized game for these handhelds. Up next, we have some multiplayer action in Halo Infinite while playing Husky Raid. The settings I'm using here are the low preset and 100% render resolution, and at 720p, we're getting some pretty good frames on both systems. The Legion Go does take the lead here with an almost 7 to 10 frame difference, as it averages around 94 to 95 frames, and the Ally is behind it, averaging around 85 to 87 frames per second. And at 900p, the performance gap does get closer between the two, as the Legion Go drops to about 72 to 73 frames, and the Ally drops to an average of about 68 to 71 frames. At 1080p, we drop to the 50s for both systems. The Legion Go maintains it in the high 50s, getting an average of 57 to 58 frames, and the Ally is closer to the mid 50s, getting an average of 55 to like 56 frames. So the performance gap seems to get closer as we go up in resolution in this game, but yeah, Halo Infinite is another well-optimized title and a really fun shooter to play on these handhelds. And speaking of shooters, next is Crysis 3, and this is running at the medium preset, and I used the beginning part of this mission where you get bombarded by those large cannons hanging on a large structure. And at 720p, we're getting good frames here on both systems. They're both averaging about 71 to 73 frames, but the Ally does have a better 1% low of 47 frames. At 900p, we actually take a pretty big hit to our performance on both systems, dropping us to the 50s. The Legion Go averages about 56 FPS, while the Ally is getting an average of about 53 to 54 FPS, and the 1% low is looking a tad bit better on the Go as well. So it's pretty interesting seeing 900p bring us all the way down to the 50s here in this game. And at 1080p, of course, we lose even more frames, bringing us down into the 40s for both systems. The Legion Go is getting an average frame rate of about 43 frames per second, while the Ally is staying at around 40 frames per second, and our 1% low is pretty identical as well. But yeah, we went from the 70s at 720p all the way down to the 40s here at 1080p, so pretty big performance difference between the various resolutions.